Hi everyone, my name is Emily Scahill. I am a Cyber Operations Planner with the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC, at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And I'm joined here today by my JCDC colleague and fellow Cyber Operational Planner, Trevor Parks, as well as Lance Pierce, who is the CEO of NetHope, and Leah McGrath, who is the Executive Director of StateRAMP. And I guess to just kick it off, who here is familiar with JCDC? Just raise your hand. Okay, that's a fair number of people. So for those of you who aren't familiar with JCDC, our mission is to unite the global cyber community in the collective defense of cyberspace. And we do that through public-private partnership. So as cyber operations planners, Trevor and I are really focused on how we can work with partners across the cyber ecosystem to really buy down cyber risk through what we call strategic planning efforts. So in March of last year, we initiated a planning effort to bolster the digital resilience of high-risk communities. And when we're talking about high-risk communities, we're talking about nonprofits, NGOs, humanitarian organizations, and the activists, human rights defenders, academics, you name it, that work for them, that might be targeted by advanced persistent threat actors. And we saw a need for this planning effort because we're increasingly seeing a rise in digital transnational repression across the globe. And so as adversaries are increasingly using technology to intimidate, surveil, harass, and even silence dissidents, we're increasingly seeing these high-risk communities caught in the crosshairs. So as we kind of initiated this planning effort, as we do with all planning efforts, JCDC joined forces with our interagency partners like the Department of State and industry partners like Cisco, IBM, and Authenticate. But what was really unique about this planning effort was that we also partnered with civil society organizations like NetHope and like StateRAMP that really specialize in digital security for high-risk communities and what we also call target-rich cyberport organizations as well. And so that's why I'm really excited to be joined by Lance and Leah today, because both NetHope and StateRAMP really helped to, in a very major way, shape the way that JCDC understands the cybersecurity challenges that high-risk communities face and where our planning effort could really add value. So in the next 50 minutes, we will dive into some of the cybersecurity challenges that high-risk communities face, and then talk about some of the ways that our industry partners in the room, as well as other government and civil society organizations, can really help bolster the digital security of these organizations. So Lance, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about NetHope, and in particular, can you talk about who are your member organizations and what are some of the cybersecurity challenges that they face?
Sure, happy to do that, Leah. Thank you very much for having us on the panel today, and thank you also very much for the invitation to take part in the planning effort. It's been incredibly important, and we appreciate the opportunity to represent the voice of civil society in helping shape some of these things, especially for the international organizations. Yeah, I'm Lance Pierce, the CEO of NetHope, and NetHope is a 23-year-old partnership between Silicon Valley and the world's leading relief, development, and conservation organizations. So our corporate partners are many of the tech companies you've heard of, the Microsofts, the Ciscos, the Salesforce, the AWS, Googles, and so on. Whereas our members are also many of the international organizations you've heard of, Oxfam Care, Save the Children, Catholic Relief Services, World Vision, and so on. About half our members are located in the United States, and about half are located in the UK, Europe, and Switzerland. We have been working really in and around cybersecurity since the very beginning. We've been an organization that's brought together CISOs, brought together technology experts, digital experts in program to really use the power of technology and data to help accelerate the mission of our member organizations. We've been really looking at this threat landscape over the last couple of years, and as a result have formalized a digital protection program at NetHope, which for us brings together really three things. It brings together cybersecurity, which is, again, the sort of the main driver that brings us here to RSA this year. But it also brings together safeguarding of people who participate in programs and staff, because people who work for international organizations and humanitarian contexts are often subject to unique risks and dangers. And it also brings together physical protection, because the cybersecurity threat model does not include someone kicking in your door, putting a gun to your head and demanding your passwords, whereas many of the organizations we work with, they work in war zones or conflict zones, do actually in fact face that threat. So we try to bring all of that together under the umbrella of digital protection. And like many of you, like so many of the themes here at this event this past week, we've been hearing about the marked increase in cyber attacks that are occurring everywhere. And civil society, international civil society, is not immune to that. We have been seeing a dramatic rise in the number of attacks, the number, kind, and sophistication of attacks on organizations like this. And when our members get attacked, often the case in a corporate setting or a government setting, you can isolate the threat, you can shut it down, you can apply various tools and methods to help solve the problem, or at least contain it until you can deal with it. But the challenge in the humanitarian context in particular is that if you apply those typical tools and approaches that are common in the private sector and probably government as well, lives may be lost. Because open access to those systems has always been a foundation of the ability to operate in these challenging and marginal contexts. And so shutting systems down in the name of digital hygiene often means that people don't get access to services, sometimes they die. And so it's a particularly challenging environment. So we've done some research that in the past year that really shows that about 2/3 of international organizations don't feel confident in their cybersecurity efforts. About 2/3 also feel like they underspend on cybersecurity, but yet 3/4 of them say that the threat is going up, not down. So it's a challenging environment from the threat landscape point of view, but also from the resource point of view as well. So many of you, if you know anything about the nonprofit sector, you know that organizations often work on what's called restricted funding. It's where grant makers will allocate a certain portion of money to go out to the mission of the organization, and they tell you what you can spend on overhead. And technology is frequently lumped into the overhead category. So it's often the case you have to make very hard trade-offs between serving your constituents with grant money that you may have to top up shortfalls in your grant making, or shore up your cybersecurity or any of the other needs that you have because you're operating in a resource-constrained environment. So cybersecurity has in recent years just been at the low end of the trade-off curve. It's just been traded off, traded off, traded off. But now that's changing because, again, the nature of the threat's increasing. It's being automated and made cheaper by AI. And it's not just ransomware. It's also frequently organizations are targeted for their data. Because if you're working in an international context, sometimes the nonprofits actually know things the governments don't know. And therefore sometimes government actors, which are one of the biggest attackers of civil society and these contexts around the world, are seeking to get that data for some form of advantage or to cause active harm. So it's a different sort of landscape, and we really have tried to spin up a couple of programs to help these organizations. We have a digital protection program, which I mentioned, which does a lot of training, capacity building, career development. And we've also, with USAID and OCTA, a couple of years ago, we launched the Global Humanitarian ISAC, which is an entity that is intended to help try to provide more of a collective security approach to the civil society sector working around the world. So it's got some unique challenges, but I'm really delighted to say, as people come together, we've heard some of the themes at this conference, it seems like awareness is growing, and I think that's really exciting, and particularly the opportunity to work with the government and to help try to develop some of these shared approaches to an ongoing problem.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you so much for that overview. So I want to dive into some of the challenges you mentioned, but first I want to turn to Leah, and could you give a little bit of a flavor for some of the types of organizations that StateRAMP works with, and do you see that they face a lot of the same challenges that Lance mentioned, or is it a different set of cybersecurity challenges?
If you talk to states and local governments, who is our primary member, all of our local governments, and I come from local governments, we consider ourselves snowflakes, right? Each of us are a little bit different. But the reality is, and I think we found this on the task force, we have a lot of the same challenges. And so there were so many different correlations, and even as you were talking now, Lance, that we've experienced. So State Ramp is a nonprofit. We're a membership organization, and we serve both the public sector and private sector. On the public sector, our members include states, local governments, K-12, higher ed, and then our private sector members are technology companies who are servicing, providing services to state and local government and education. And then also just the rest of the cybersecurity ecosystem, from consultants to advisors to the ones who are doing the audits. The challenges that we see, and I'll just put it into context, I'm from Indiana. Woohoo, Midwest. I'm the state you're probably flying over to get home after this. But we have great people, and we have our state government, but we also have over 500 municipalities that include cities and towns who have hundreds of people to hundreds of thousands of people. We have 92 counties, almost 300 school districts. Every one of those organizations is facing the same challenges that you described in terms of, they have a lot of pressure from the citizens who elect them to make sure that they are putting the dollars to the services, right? That they're the dollars to the classrooms or the dollars to the services that they're providing. And cybersecurity and technology for a long, long time just got pushed into that administrative bucket of expenditures that we try to keep really, really low. We try to keep the overhead really low. And that means that there's a lot of, deferred investment and maintenance and attention that has happened. And, the other thing, so you've got resource constraints, but we also, I've not talked to an organization yet who has all the budget and bandwidth and talent that they would like to have on staff to be able to do the things they need to do from a cybersecurity standpoint. And these are target rich from a cyber crime standpoint. And these are the organizations who are teaching our kids, who are managing our police data and our criminal information data, and really importantly, managing a lot of our critical infrastructure utilities like water and wastewater and, in the rural areas, broadband. And so the State Ramp exists. We were founded by current and former state leaders who came together with industry to say, hey, one of the challenges that we face is how to manage third-party risks. How do we manage third-party suppliers? And how do we know that when we're partnering with a technology that it meets minimum security standards, not just now, but ongoing? How do we have visibility into that? Because we know we have responsibility for our environment and for training our people and for doing those updates, but what about the technologies that we're reliant on to serve our constituents? And so that's why State Ramp was formed, to help with that. But our mission is to educate on best practices for cybersecurity. So we find ourselves really kind of in two buckets. One, trying to help those providers who need to mature their cyber posture, right, to grow that and mature that. But then two, to really partner with organizations like MSISAC and Center for Internet Security and others to be able to provide that education to our participating governments, whether that's K-12 schools or local governments, to try to say, hey, there's a shared responsibility here, and how can we help make that simpler for you? So we see a lot of the same challenges. And on the task force, I think that's what we realized, right, was when we're talking about these under-resourced, target-rich, smaller organizations or big organizations, we're all facing a lot of the same challenges, and it's going to require the private industry coming alongside and all of us finding those points of collaboration to be able to address them.
Amazing. And so I think what your responses have highlighted are NetHope is focused more on kind of the larger international NGOs. Mm-hmm. State Ramp is focused more on smaller organizations that have an outsized impact on their local communities because of the critical public services that they're providing. So Trevor, turning to you, CISA has a growing focus on what we call target-rich, resource-poor, or target-rich, cyber-poor organizations. So can you talk a little bit about how CISA thinks about high-risk communities kind of in relation to target-rich, resource-poor? And then in addition to that, why does CISA care about these entities even when they don't fall neatly under a particular critical infrastructure sector?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Emily. The reason why CISA is really kind of vested in the protection of these high-risk communities is they actually do a lot of work within our critical infrastructure. You know, you have organizations that work within healthcare, that work within education. As Lance pointed out earlier, some of these organizations have a lot of data that maybe the government isn't even aware of that they have. So we really want to make sure that we are helping them protect their data, because in doing that, we are protecting our own interests as the US and helping protect our critical infrastructure. We also see, you know, as Lee was pointing out, that a lot of these smaller organizations in rural areas or K through 12 schools, they have a lot of the same pain points that these high-risk communities have as well, right? So there are a lot of the lessons that we can pull from having created Project Upskill and this project entirely, that we can look and say, we can actually apply this in other areas, because we know that these solutions can help in some way to help those organizations.
Awesome. And so Lance, to go back to a point that you made a little bit earlier, so Director Easterly in testimony on the Hill has said recently that, you know, cyber risk is business risk, right? But I think for a lot of the organizations that we're talking about today, cyber risk is actually mission risk, right? Yes. And so I think whether, you know, it's an international humanitarian organization or your local health clinic, the stakes are really high when it comes to cybersecurity. So could you talk a little bit about, within the context of NetHope, like what are the stakes for your members when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize Leah's point as well, that these are the same attackers. This would probably not have been the case 5-10 years ago, that the same attackers would be coming after local governments in the United States or international organizations working in conflict zones. But today that's not true. They're the same people, it's the same entities, the same institutions. And you know, ransomware, of course, is a problem because that's the money, that's the operating lifeblood of the organization, and that is an issue, and that's often what we focus on. But in our sector, as I mentioned, the data is increasingly important. Data is a commodity being stolen, and in war zones that can be particularly sensitive, because we've seen, Ukraine is a good example of this, where data has been stolen from local nonprofits in an attempt to sort out who to monitor, who to harass, and who to target for kill. And so the challenge, of course, is that all of our programs, all of our organizations today are digital. Digital is not locked up in a closet somewhere that's sort of metered out by the high priests of IT so that people get to use it the way that it used to be. It's now distributed. It's everywhere in your organization. It sits in every job description. Every seat in your organization is a generator and a consumer of data. And your programs are all driven by data. It's all driven by your ability to track your metrics, track your participation, track your impact. So with the collection of all of that being necessary to do your work, you also have a higher responsibility to protect that data. And if you collect the data to do the work, and the data gets stolen and harm comes to people, you may be in a situation as an organization where you've actually done the opposite of what your mission is. The data, if it can't be adequately protected, may then be used to harm the people that you're trying to help. And so this is why we see leadership in some of the international organizations beginning to wake up to the fact that this question of cybersecurity is really existential for them. That if you have to collect data to do your work and you can't adequately protect the data, you shouldn't collect the data. That means you can't do your work. So, but has been said multiple times throughout RSA this week, but you know, by large influential companies to large, well-resourced influential companies, we can't do this alone. And that's especially true for, I think, state and local government, and certainly for civil society. We really do need to find collective ways of working together in order to get out ahead of this and get around this. You know, the various ISACs have been mentioned here. We partner with Center for Internet Security, which has been a tremendous partner, tremendous resource partner to us. We benchmark our members against the CIS controls. They've really helped us with the design of the Global Humanitarian ISAC. They, of course, run 2 of the ISACs, the state and local ISAC, and then the elections ISAC. And so that's a good example. That and the other industry ISACs are good examples of how people have banded together to kind of address some of these issues. We think more collective action is going to be required, not less. More thoughtful information sharing, more strategic ways of working together. A lot of this is not a product problem. It's not a technology problem. I mean, to be sure, if you're dealing with military grade software that's being deployed in attack mode, or AI that's automating that, that's the technology problem. But so much of this comes down to human error, social engineering attacks, deception, and playing on the trust and goodwill of people to gain access to trusted spaces. And so that really does take a village to help try to manage that in a way that we can continue to retain the trust and do the work that needs to be done here in some of the life-saving work, particularly that our member organizations work on.
That's super helpful. And Leah, I'd like to ask you a similar question. So Lance had mentioned earlier that funding is always a challenge, right? And so within State Ramp's kind of work, and especially your work with K through 12 organizations, municipalities, how do you kind of navigate those tensions between the funding and also communicating the stakes and like why organizations need to be investing in cybersecurity?
We have some, it's a great question. We have some really great strategic partners. And so, try to collaborate there to kind of bring that full circle, right? Whether it's working with NASCIO, the National Association of State Chief Information Officers, MSISAC and CIS, as you mentioned, and so many more who I think can help really provide those resources. What we really do and focus on at State Ramp is create a shared service, right? Where you have a shared common problem, there's usually an opportunity for a shared common solution. And so we have a verification process or security programs that allows then providers who serve government to kind of verify once, modeled in part after FedRAMP, the federal program, and then we also have a progressing program as well that allows folks to kind of gives them a runway and step into it and mature their programs. So that program is really important because it allows providers to be able to kind of do it once, right, in order to serve their many government customers in K-12 and states and locals. And then it allows the governments to be able to kind of offload that burden of having to do that verification. They're still responsible for what only they can be responsible for, that risk management. But it allows that kind of shared service model. So by doing that, we are helping relieve some of that burden and giving them the opportunity to focus resources elsewhere. Then we, as I mentioned, partner with strategic partners, partner with our members, to be able to deliver education and say, what's the gap? Where do we need to go now? And really the gap that we've seen, on the state and local side is helping mature that risk management program. So we've been developing a framework for adoption of State Ramp that helps them, states, locals, any government entity kind of coming through the process, step in where they're ready, and then it's a milestone-based approach to maturing that risk management program. And I think that's what we have to really embrace, is that concept of how do we just take small incremental steps to get better? How do we find areas where we can work together to kind of share the burden? And that can be hard to do because, especially in government, I don't know about your world, but in government, I call it the merry-go-round of what ifs, but yes. This. And so you have to be able to go, okay, I'm going to put aside the 10% where we're different and where that snowflake label does apply and focus on that 90% where we have the same goals or challenges and focus there. And so we really, we've got all the committee structures that try to help drive toward that kind of commonality and consensus. But that's where we really try to focus.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think kind of continuing on that education and awareness theme. Yeah. So within the JCDC planning effort that we were working on over the past year, one of the areas where we really saw that we could add value, because we'd heard from several stakeholders, is that a lot of, at the staff level, a lot of these organizations there's kind of the lack of awareness of how personal cyber hygiene can translate to organizational cybersecurity, and then how that translates to mission risk. And so one of the things that we did through our JCDC planning effort was create what we called Project Upskill, which is a series of cybersecurity hygiene guides that are really aimed for more of a non-technical audience to help them take steps to really be able to improve their personal cyber hygiene. So Trevor, having worked with you on developing Project Upskill, I think we both learned just how challenging it is to develop cybersecurity guidance for individuals whose day jobs don't really revolve around information technology. So could you talk to me a little bit about what was the intent behind Project Upskill, and what were some of the considerations that went into it?
Yeah, so we did learn a lot of really good lessons through developing Project Upskill. We really, we wanted to hear the voices of these organizations. A lot of what CISA has done traditionally has been enterprise level cybersecurity. And one of the challenges we were facing is these organizations just don't have the manpower or infrastructure to even utilize that level of protection in their systems. So we had to look and say, okay, well, what do they have, right? And it's a lot of what everyone else has at home in their pocket right now. They have their own phone, they have their own laptop, they probably have their own Wi-Fi at home, or they have a small office, right, where they're taking care of their entire digital ecosystem. And what cybersecurity tools are part of those ecosystems, and how do we get it to a point to where someone who doesn't have a cybersecurity background understands all the things that they can do throughout their own digital ecosystem to make it a harder target for these advanced persistent threat actors who are no longer satisfied with going after big companies and governments. They're going after these smaller organizations who don't have those enterprise level protections. So there's a lot of things out there that they could do, but it's very hard to find that information on where that is, right? If you find a setting in one of your devices, you can look it up on Google, and you might find 10 pages telling you, 3 different things that you should or shouldn't do with it. But we really wanted all that advice in one location so someone could go through it and basically do a checklist of, okay, what do I need to do? What can I do today to help myself be a little bit safer? And that was a very hard set because we had to also look at it from what is someone capable of understanding and doing themselves, right? So there might be a lot of settings that you have in your device that if you're a cybersecurity professional, you know what it is, you know how to flip it on, and you're comfortable with that degradation of access because you have the more security. But someone that doesn't work in this industry might not understand why they need to turn that on. So we really wanted to kind of educate them on the reason why you're doing these things is for these level of benefits, to protect your data. Like this is part of an entire ecosystem that you have to watch out for. And I think that's really one of the best things that came out of there, along with working with some of our private industry partners and actually getting some of those tools, those free services that you can actually find on our high-risk community webpage that they have offered up for these organizations to be able to utilize if they so choose.
Awesome. And I think to pull the thread a little bit more here, so we saw Project Upskill as filling kind of a critical gap in CISA's guidance for high-risk communities. But I also want to fully acknowledge that Project Upskill still puts the burden of security on individuals or organizations that are probably least equipped to do so. And so if we really do want to make a difference in this space, we really do need industry to take action. So as we were preparing for this panel, we had the idea to collaborate on a blog post where we listed some of the top things that industry can do to support target-rich resource poor organizations and also high-risk communities. So one of the recommendations that came out of that blog post was for companies to embrace secure by design principles. So Lance, I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on why it's so important for companies to be embracing these secure by design principles, and in particular, like what impact does this have for high-risk communities?
The technology teams at some of the really large international organizations can be quite good and quite sophisticated, but the problem is there aren't as many of those at the global level, or when you get into their country offices, then you have a different level of skills and expertise. So things that are secure by design, actually, that are designed to be used in a largely safe fashion, I think is very important, just given the skills gap that's still out there, the knowledge gap, the awareness gap. We have found that in many of the organizations we work with, just on the sort of the threat information level, for example, we could provide people with the best threat information that's out there because of our industry partners, but they wouldn't be able to make use of it, right? There's not the capacity within the organization or the decision-making authority to be able to make decisions about resources, about strategy, about deployment, and so on. So if the technology is either going to exacerbate that and make that worse, or it's going to provide some bit of backstopping while organizations skill up in this way, as they are increasingly waking up to the fact they have to do. Again, this was not a skill set that was, it was sort of, I think one of us was talking about how it was assumed that the person who hooked up the printer was going to cover you with your cybersecurity, and didn't I buy the virus software, right? Aren't I protected? And that's just, it's never been reality, and it's certainly not that now. So Secure by Design really is one of the ways in which it helps to sort of provide some base backstopping. And while we're working to sort of upskill an entire sector and train a new generation of people who are going to deliver these services and to be able to do that work. So, that's one of the roles that industry can play in really helping this out.
Awesome, yeah. And so a second recommendation was around having customer responsibility matrix and simplified instructions as part of a product's offering and implementation. Yeah. So Leah, could you talk a little bit more about why we thought this was an important recommendation?
Oh, absolutely. We hear this often from our participating governments, because when they are going through that procurement process or they're implementing a new technology, especially if it's gone through something like, oh, it's state ramp authorized or it has this certification, we understand there's a shared responsibility there. So even if it comes out of the box with some of these secure by default, features, even through implementation or just not knowing better, we might be turning those off or on, as you mentioned. Right. And so part of it was something that was very important that we were hearing quite often from our members. And so when we updated our most recent security requirements for our program, we actually included a page within that security package that providers are submitting that includes a shared responsibility matrix. And so which controls then are responsible for that government entity who's purchasing it. And so the way our program works, providers have the ability to provision access to their government customers to have that documentation, but they could also just take that one page. And that's something after we had the conversation, I'm like, we should pull that out of the workbook and actually make it its own standing thing, because I think it's so important. It's part of the education around, this is a shared responsibility. And that's the other thing that I love about, I was thinking the education that you're doing on the individual level of just, hey, I'm a person, I need to be responsible and think about my own cyber hygiene, or the PSA work that's happening from CISA just generally around being more cyber aware. But we all have a role in cybersecurity, and I think we're all just realizing it. And still, we were talking earlier too, a lot of times you go to an organization and say, who owns cybersecurity? You get a little bit of this, right? Because we're trying to figure it out still. What exactly is my role in my organization? And so I think that, the more we can do to help drive that conversation and awareness, the better, which is why that shared responsibility matrix is so important.
Awesome. And one of the final recommendations that we have in that blog is around industry contributing time and resources to high-risk communities. So Trevor, I know that you alluded to it earlier, but could you talk a little bit about some of the resources that are on CISA's webpage and how industry can plug into those?
Yeah, so we've had good success with some of our private industry partners in helping like offer their resources. If anyone out there is familiar with Project Galileo from Cloudflare, Authenticate, a company, they have a product called Silo that they have offered up a part of that for civil society, which by the way is a program that they did not have with their company before we talked to them. They heard about this work and thought it was, you know, in everyone's best interest that they had something that they could offer. Yubico has been a great partner. They have a really good program for their YubiKeys for, you know, helping people with the multi-factor authentication, especially using a hardware token, which is very important, especially for these organizations that need really good security. That's just a really powerful tool. And I look forward to working with, you know, any other company out there that thinks that they have a good product that they would like featured on our page. We're still open for business, so you can reach out.
Awesome. And then the one final thing I'll highlight on our webpage is our Cyber Volunteer Resource Center. So how many of you know about Cyber Volunteer Resource Clinics? Yeah, so not that many, right? So there's a movement across the country, both at universities and at kind of the state and local level, where organizations are creating what are called cyber volunteer clinics. And on the university side, basically they take their third and fourth year students and connect them with organizations that are under-resourced and help them to do kind of cyber hygiene assessments, which is really cool. It's a great way to upskill the future cyber talent pipeline while also providing resources to under-resourced organizations. And then there's also organizations like the Cyber Peace Institute, which draw on the expertise of industry. And so industry partners can be virtual CISOs for a lot of these under-resourced organizations, which is really cool. So that's like another way that industry can kind of give back to the target-rich cyber poor community, which is really great. And there's a webpage on CISA.gov where you can learn more about cyber volunteer programs in your area. So yeah, that's just another resource that I wanted to highlight. So I think we have a couple of minutes left for Q&A. So if anybody has a question, they can line up. But while we're waiting for that, I have one final question for all of you, which is, and I know this puts all of you on the spot a little bit, but if there's one thing that you'd like the audience to take away from today's conversation, what would it be? And Trevor, I'll start with you.
I would say that as an industry, I think we have a responsibility to start making these products more secure and easier for the user, have better education, and look for things that may be an optional setting in your product that doesn't really need to be an option. Is it something that should just be secure, period? You know, take a little bit of the burden off of the users on them trying to figure out how to secure your product and just make it safe for them.
Awesome. Over to you, Lance.
I have two things.
Okay.
I would say that really for government and industry, help us make the case that civil society is critical infrastructure that needs protecting. So the NetHope members, we only have 65 members, but those 65 members work in 190 countries and serve over 1.6 billion people with 750,000 employees, with hundreds of thousands of volunteers, all of which are involved in helping deliver critical services that are saving lives, educating children, providing critical care, and on, and for everything you can imagine. If this is not critical infrastructure, what is? And we need to be doing more to protect that and including that in the calculus. And I would say the second thing that I would just say is that really this is also for government and industry. We do need your convening, we need your product, we need your talent and expertise, but we do need money. It takes money for civil society organizations even to manage a product donation. Right, that's time that we have to spend doing something that's in addition to or on top of existing work. So just bear in mind that when nonprofits come to you and they have a look of conflict in their eyes when you're offering them product, it's not because they don't want the product, it's because they've got to spend time, money, and resources, people time to manage that product and make sure it gets matched to where it goes. That is often a pretty labor-intensive exercise. So all the organizations working on this do need money to operate their programs. Please don't forget that. And if you can find ways to support that, you'll go a long way. $1 million in support of cybersecurity is high leverage. It will guarantee almost vastly more than $1 million worth of damage avoided, harm avoided, no matter where you look. We should be the poster child for the big argument for RSA's existence in the first place, and I think that's just, I'm hoping that lands with a willing audience here.
And Leah, close us out.
I will, and we have some questions. So I'll be quick. I was just going to say, get involved. Help make the case at your local level, your state level, with the organizations that you give to and that you're a part of, because you're the experts and understand the challenges that everyone's facing. And sometimes the hardest thing that we hear, from the IT leaders or the security leaders at all levels of government is they need help making the case to the public policy leaders, to that city council, the town council, the school board, the elected leaders who are making these decisions. So help make that case and get involved.
Awesome.
And you can join State Ramp too.
Sweet. Okay, over to Q&A.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to all four of you and the resources that you're providing. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, but in the county that I live in, there is one CISSP for the entire county.
That's right.
And when I started doing cybersecurity for small nonprofits, small city governments, over 10 years ago, there were there were less than no resources available. And I have seen the attacks increase exponentially in recent years, starting off with 10 years ago, somebody's posing as the director of a nonprofit on social media to do scams, to now endpoint compromise, going after payroll systems, 2 BEC attacks against our school district within 12 months of each other, and the list just goes on and on, ransomware of cities and whatnot. So I'm just very grateful that those resources are available now, and I'm excited to try to bring those back to my community.
Awesome.
All right, so thank you very much. The question I have is more about managed security services. So is that something that, you're nailing it. I give you a puppy, you gotta care for the puppy, and operations is the infrastructure and operations aspect of any sort of, as small as an organization is going to be, it's going to have an I&O group. And that is usually about 70 to 80% of the time. They have no time for projects, and that stifles innovation or the introduction of anything new. Is there any movement towards not just providing products, but also providing the services to run them?
Well, I can speak to that. We have a saying in NetHope, there's sort of free as in beer and free as in puppy. And you can probably tell which one is more desirable in the short term and which one's got longer term consequences. So a lot of the managed services in a global context are dependent on universal broadband. And so NetHope was for 10 years a USAID prime contractor on a global broadband initiative to help try to bring that in. And that's resulted in a lot more cloud penetration, a lot more ability to offer some of these services. The companies are increasingly looking at these things. There are packages available, there are some deals and some discounts and things like that. But as the business model has migrated away from standalone software to cloud-oriented services, the companies have been a little more measured, I guess, in their willingness to give that away and to what degree they give that away and so on. So it's not a neat, clean answer. But the bigger organizations are moving more and more to the managed programs that allow them to operate more securely in that space. But there's probably more that could be done philanthropically around that too.
And I guess also just to add on that from the CISA perspective, when we were looking at what JCDC could do in this space and where we could add value, one of the things that we heard from a lot of stakeholders is that they really do need that hands-on keyboard support, right? And so the way that we approached it was really partnering with the cyber volunteer clinics that can provide some of that hands-on keyboard support, but even those, have scalability issues. And at one point, the idea of kind of creating an MSSP that could support nonprofits was kind of thrown around. But again, like funding is always a question too, right? But yeah, I think it really just does highlight that need for the hands-on keyboard support for a lot of these target-rich resource poor organizations. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the panel. My name is Erica. I work at an international NGO, DAI. My question is for Trevor. I was wondering with Project Upskill if you have any data on the users, like any general types of users that you've had, or which modules have been the most popular.
So as a government organization, we aren't really looking to collect information on the users. You know, there's legal issues with that. We do work with a lot of other organizations like NetHope and StateRAMP, who are able to actually like reach out and work side by side with the users. So while I don't have a satisfactory answer for you, but I would say when it comes to what you need most out of Project Upskill, what would be most useful for you, for any user, I think you need to start with what do you use the most, and what do you have that maybe you've never even thought about securing. If you get on the web page and you go to the Project Upskill page, you'll find several different categories of information on what to go through. So I would say just get comfortable with it. It's there for you to learn, and I hope it serves you well. And my information is up here. I'll get you my information after this if you want to go through it and then reach back to me and let me know how the experience was for you. I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Project Upskill is a new resource, right? And so we are looking for feedback from anyone in the audience on how it could be more useful of a resource, and as we continue to kind of develop the threat model for Project Upskill as well, and really understanding from NGOs and the staff at NGOs kind of the threats that they're facing. And then I think just one other thing that we really learned from developing Project Upskill was that CIS is traditionally focused on traditional cybersecurity vulnerabilities, but Project Upskill also touches a lot on kind of like the OSINT-based threats that NGOs and high-risk communities might be more exposed to than the average user. So that's definitely something where Trevor had a lot of.
Yeah, I think especially for something like that, a lot of these organizations, they use social media to get their message out, right? But that's also a sort of downfall, because when we look at what these APTs do, very much once they kind of notice an organization, they will go out and do open source research to get as much information they can about you that will lead in to their social engineering attacks, right? So having a better secure social media and really managing that presence, knowing your security controls on there, being aware of what information you're putting out there on, which you can find some of that in Project Upskill as well, is very important, because that is just one of the biggest things I can say is the data that you have about yourself and your organization out there. While it is a very good tool to get you noticed so you can go out and do the mission that you want to do, it's also going to be used against you.
Awesome. Well, so I know we are standing between you and Alicia Keys, so we won't keep you any longer. But thank you so much for listening to our panel today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to come up to us after the panel.